evening and welcome to the Chatham Marconi Speaker Series. My name is Liz McCart and I'm a volunteer here. We are so pleased that you are here with us tonight. Thank you for your participation and your support. As a quick reminder, you can ask questions during the presentation by hovering your mouse over the bottom of your screen and where you'll see a Q&A box. Type your question in the box and we will have Dr. Loring answer as many questions at the end of the presentation as possible. We started working with tonight's speaker, Dr. Loring, late last fall. The museum committee started researching wildlife tracking for a new exhibit this season and discovered that Pam Loring was studying birds using radio tracking at the Monomoy Wildlife Refuge and in other areas. So we are so pleased that she is assisting us with the development of our exhibit, as well as agreeing to make a presentation tonight to discuss her key findings, as well as to talk about monitoring birds in offshore wind energy areas. So it is my privilege and pleasure tonight to introduce Pam. She is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Migratory Birds. She works on a range of projects related to the conservation and management of shorebirds and seabirds throughout the Western Hemisphere. Pam received a PhD in environmental conservation from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and a Master's of Science in Biological and Environmental Sciences from the University of Rhode Island. For her graduate research, she used satellite and digital VHF technologies to estimate movement patterns and habitat use of seabirds, shorebirds, and terns in the Western North Atlantic. Pam, thank you so much for your support of CMMC. We really appreciate it and for being here tonight. So I will now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Liz, for that really nice introduction, and to Chatham CMMC for hosting this webinar tonight. And thank you all for joining us. It's great to see the turnout and the interest in this topic. Well, thanks again. So the title of this talk is Tracking Shorebirds and Seabirds of the North Atlantic. So why do we track birds with radio transmitters and other types of tracking technologies? There are a range of questions and information gaps that can be addressed using tracking technology, including information on the movements of birds and their habitat use. And this information is really important to help informing conservation and management decisions. So a lot of the work that I've done has been in the southern New England region and elsewhere along the Atlantic coast, looking at using different types of tracking technologies to address information gaps around the offshore movements of birds to help inform decisions around marine spatial planning, including siting of offshore wind energy facilities. So this is one of my favorite pictures. Actually, it's a black scoter, which is a sea duck that we instrumented for my master's research at the University of Rhode Island during the winter. And they pair up in late winter. So a local photographer actually from the vineyard took this picture of one of our females who had apparently found a mate. So some of the goals of the talk are to provide some examples of different types of tracking technologies that we use to track birds, including radio telemetry, which is now automated and digital, and I'll get into that a little bit more later on in the talk, as well as satellite and GPS-based telemetry. I'll be presenting some results from studies that we've conducted in the Atlantic and giving an update on some of our current efforts that we're working on currently. On the photo here is a red knot, which is a shorebird that breeds up in the Arctic regions of Canada and migrates all the way down to the southernmost tip of South America. So this was a red knot that was captured up in Canada and is marked with a transmitter red knot stage in large numbers on Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge in Chatham during their migration. So the first type of technology that I'll be discussing is automated radio telemetry. And this involves the use of lightweight radio transmitters that weigh as little as 0.2 of a gram. The transmitters emit signals every 5 seconds around the clock, and they're on a shared frequency. So the tags in the pictures below are all tuned to 166 megahertz, but each of them have a unique ID code within their transmission, which allows them to be uniquely identified on that shared frequency. So the benefit of this automated radio telemetry technology is that many individuals, many thousands, can be simultaneously monitored from shared tracking equipment. And these tags are so light, they can be used on insects like dragonflies, pretty much any species of bat and any species of bird as well. So this is a picture of a roseate tern. They are a federally endangered seabird that nest in the northeastern US and winter down in South America. And this is a tern that I tagged as part of my dissertation work at UMass Amherst with a 1 gram automated radio transmitter. So you can see next to a penny for reference the size of the transmitter. So to track signals from birds, bats, and insects that are tagged with these coded radio transmitters, we set up, much like Marconi, but not quite as tall, an array of towers throughout the southern New England region and elsewhere along the Atlantic coast. The towers are 40 feet tall, and they have an array of 6 Yagi antennas at the top in a radial configuration. So those Yagi antennas are highly directional. So we set up 6 of them to get 360-degree coverage. The antennas are connected with coax cable to an electronics box at the base of the tower that contains a solar-powered receiving unit. And it basically logs information from any bird or bat wearing one of these transmitters that's flying by within detection range, which is typically around 15 to 20 kilometers. So every time a bird or bat flies by with a transmitter, it will record information on the receiving antenna, which gives us a bearing of the animal's movement path, the signal strength value, which gives us an approximate distance to the station, the tag ID, and the timestamp. And using those data, we can do some modeling to estimate their flight paths. So this particular station was set up at the Southeast Lighthouse on Block Island here in Rhode Island, where I'm based. So there is a coordinated international automated radio telemetry network called the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System that links tagging projects and tracking stations across the globe. So currently, the MODIS network consists of over 847 tracking stations that are operated by over 700 collaborators who have collectively tagged over 20,000 different animals representing 200 different species. And the centralized database that houses detection data from all of the tagged animals and tracking stations worldwide currently has over 1 billion detections. So it's one of the biggest wildlife tracking databases that exists. And the map on the right shows the distribution of tracking stations in the Western Hemisphere. And you can see that they range all the way up from Arctic Canada down into South America. So it's been a really exciting network to be a part of. And this network, just a little bit of history, was actually first piloted up in Nova Scotia by a faculty member at Acadia University named Phil Taylor that had some of these stations and tested out kind of this regional array of tracking stations. And then he ended up sending some tracking equipment down to my PhD advisor at UMass Amherst and asked us to set up some towers on Cape Cod because he had just tagged these little blackpoll warblers that are known for doing open water migratory flights. So a few grad students and I took this, box of equipment out to Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge and set up a station down by the lighthouse, as well as one up on Morris Island near the dormitory, and actually detected some of the birds from Canada. So that was one of the early kind of pilot tests of this MODIS network, which has now grown over the past decade into a big international collaboration. So it's been really cool to be a part of. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview on a study that we conducted using automated radio telemetry during 2014 to 2017 to track regional movements of 3 focal species: the common tern, the roseate tern, and the piping plover. And the real goal of this study was to look at their movement patterns around southern New England, and to look at the timing and weather conditions of their offshore movements to help inform assessments around different offshore wind energy areas that were under consideration. So a little bit about our focal species. The common tern and roseate tern are 2 seabirds that nest in the Northeast and migrate down to South America. The roseate tern goes to Brazil, and the common tern goes all the way down into Argentina. The roseate tern is federally endangered, and the common tern is a species of concern on many of the state endangered species lists. There's one of the largest common tern colonies in the Atlantic, located right down the road at Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge. So it's really an amazing sight to see terns during the breeding period. They also do have a few roseate terns nesting there, but there's larger colonies in Buzzards Bay and Long Island Sound that are super important for the roseate tern population. And then our other focal species was the piping plover, which is a federally threatened shorebird that nests on Atlantic coast beaches and winters down in the southeastern US and into the Caribbean. So this map shows the locations where we tagged birds from our focal species. So in total, between 2014 and 2017, we tagged 266 common terns from colonies in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, as well as on Monomoy. 150 roseate terns from Buzzards Bay and Great Gull Island, which is in eastern Long Island Sound, and 150 piping plovers, half from Monomoy and adjacent South Beach, and the other half from coastal Rhode Island. So the stars show the various locations where we tagged our terns and plovers, and the polygons that you can see out in the offshore areas show different lease and planning areas that are under consideration for development of offshore wind energy facilities. So you can see that there's some pretty extensive areas of the Mid-Atlantic Bight that are under consideration for development. And one of our main objectives was to track movement patterns throughout this region to get a better sense of whether or not birds are flying through these areas and under what conditions they're doing so. So this is the view of the top of the radio telemetry tower that I showed a picture of at Block Island, right at the grounds of the Southeast Lighthouse. And you can actually see the Block Island wind farm in the distance. It's about 5 kilometers away. So our early work was very focused on piloting these methods as a possible technology to collect information on movements of birds relative to wind turbines. So a little bit about some results from the piping plover. So the piping plover, as I said, breeds along the US Atlantic coast, including really important populations in Massachusetts, and migrates down to southeastern US and Caribbean. So we were looking to use this tracking technology to address a long-standing question around whether piping plovers, when they take off for migration from Cape Cod, do they take the more direct route across the ocean to reach their wintering areas, or do they take a longer, potentially more energetically demanding route along the coast, which has more opportunities to land, but is also longer, and there's a lot more falcons during migration. So because there was no good tracking technology before these tags were made small enough for use on piping plovers, there really wasn't really good information on how they migrated. So that was a question that we were looking to try to get some information on. So I'm going to show a movie showing the tracks of the piping plovers that we tagged, and I'll see if it plays. Liz, can you see the movie playing now on PowerPoint?
Yes, it's going. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we tagged in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island, and you can see that now we're into July and piping plovers are starting to shoot across the mid-Atlantic bight. So it was really exciting to see, these piping plovers in large numbers taking that shorter distance offshore route that doesn't allow them to necessarily, stop midway. This red bird only looks like it stopped because that's where we lost the track. But again, the coastal route, being a shorebird, they can kind of use coastal habitat to rest and refuel, whereas the offshore route, they're pretty committed to that flight. So it was cool to see them do that, seemingly no problem. So some key findings on our work with piping plovers, we found that they do indeed migrate offshore. Their migration occurs in peak numbers during late July through early August. They initiated migration right around sunset between 6 and 9 p.m. local time. So they were migrating nocturnally. And they selected evenings where there were tailwinds that were blowing to the southwest to help assist that long distance flight over open water. So now switching species to our common and roseate terns. So again, the common and roseate terns are seabirds. They nest colonially in select colonies throughout the northeastern US. And they migrate down to South America, Brazil, all the way down to Argentina for the commons. So there's been some information from previous studies showing that they migrate pretty far offshore. And we were looking at kind of honing in on their movements throughout the southern New England, New York Bight area. So we tagged the birds at nesting colonies, and I will play a movie now showing their movements. So we tagged one bird actually at Breezy Point down in New York. So that was like the first one. And then Buzzards Bay birds you can see, as well as birds from Monomoy, and then Great Gull Island down in eastern Long Island Sound. So now we're into July, and we had just tons of movements throughout the southern New England shelf, back and forth, lots of movements out to Cape Cod. It's a really big staging area. So staging is the period of time that birds rest and refuel prior to migration. So sites like Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge that have known very abundant food resources and protected areas where they can safely roost at night are critically important for birds that migrate throughout the hemisphere and rely on sites like that to prepare for migration. So we had a lot of data on movements of terns during the breeding and post-breeding period, but because we only were using land-based towers that had a detection range of maximum 15 to 20 kilometers, we weren't really able to get good data on their migratory flights all the way down to South America. And that is a huge question with respect to kind of these broader scale movements of terns. So because the migratory routes were offshore of the locations of the MODIS towers, which you can see as the yellow dots on the map, we did a pilot study using brand new satellite transmitters that weighed 2 grams that were available from a wildlife tracking company on a limited production basis. So we were able to be kind of one of the pilot testers of these super lightweight satellite transmitters. So these transmitters are solar powered, so they can last about 2 years with enough available sunlight to recharge the battery. They operate on the Argos system, which is basically a constellation of satellites that's able to do geolocation using measurements on the Doppler shift. So the accuracy isn't quite as good as GPS tags. It's about 250 meters to 1.5 kilometers, depending on the number of satellites in view. But it's a global tracking technology that would provide information on the movements of these birds all throughout their migratory range. So these tags collect location data every 6 to 48 hours, depending on, the charge of the battery and how many satellites are within view. So we conducted this work up at Maine Coastal Islands National Wildlife Refuge on Petite Manane Island. And we tagged a total of 5 common terns using these new transmitters. So I'm going to show a series of data starting with the migratory staging period. So we tag the birds at their nest sites, and this is now when they're moving away from their nest sites. Their chicks have now learned to fly, and they're getting ready to fly down to South America. But first they have to fatten up. So this female fledged 1 chick. So one of its chicks successfully grew up and was able to fly in mid-July. And then on July 31st, it departed from Maine at dusk. It flew across the Gulf of Maine to Cape Cod at a speed of 11 meters per second, which is interesting if you're like a tern tracker, but maybe not for a general audience. And then hung out at Monomoy and around Nantucket during early August, and then departed from Monomoy on August 6th for migration. So our second female that we tagged fledged one of its chicks on July 22nd, departed from the Gulf of Maine on August 3rd, took a little bit more of a coastal route, but again, went to Cape Cod, took a little bit slower speed getting down there. Probably it was, eating fish along the way. And then hung out kind of in southeastern Massachusetts and migrated on August 16th. So the males were pretty interesting. So this male, his nest failed on June 22nd, so all of the chicks were lost, which is not uncommon for terns. Departed from Maine August 19th, flew across the Gulf of Maine, hung out on Outer Cape, hung out at Monomoy, down to Buzzards Bay, and then migrated in mid-September. And then this male fledged 2 chicks, departed from Maine in mid-September, flew across the Gulf of Maine, again hung out on Cape Cod, South Shore of Massachusetts, and then its transmitter went offline in late September. But we actually recaptured this bird at the nesting colony the following year. So we knew it was him because he had a dead transmitter, and B, a leg band that was uniquely identifiable. So we were able to take the transmitter off and let the bird go, and he was fine. So this male fledged 1 chick in mid-July, and then it hung out in Canada for a little while, right on the border. And then in late August, departed from Maine. It kind of flew past Nantucket and kept going, which was pretty amazing. And it looked like it was just going to go straight for migration. But then way offshore of the mid-Atlantic, it took a detour and went back to the coast. And I actually pulled the weather buoy data when it took that detour. And when it departed, it had a nice tailwind, but then it hit a pretty stiff headwind out in the middle of the ocean and went back to shore. Shot back up to Montauk and then back to Cape Cod, where it hung out until September 12th. So the migration data is super interesting from these birds because it's the first kind of most detailed tracks of tern migration routes across the Atlantic using this new technology. So the females did pretty well. This one left on August 7th. Flew pretty much across the open Atlantic down to Puerto Rico, and then arrived in South America August 13th. So in total, she took 6 days to go a little over 3,000 kilometers with a mean speed of 8 meters per second. Second female took a really similar route to the first. Pretty much straight shot, no problem, across the Atlantic, 6 days, 8 meters per second. So the males left a little bit later. So now we have 2 males that are still on Cape Cod, and the third had a dead transmitter, so we were no longer collecting data from it. So now we're into early September when the males are migrating, and it was a really big hurricane season in 2017. So we've got a couple males on Cape Cod and Hurricane Jose kind of going through the Caribbean. So it's spinning around. Oh, and our first male left, number 745, mid-September. So he's flying across the ocean. Jose is making its way north. And then on September 16th, it actually flew through Jose. So I would check the data every morning with my cup of coffee. And I knew the hurricane was out there and I knew the turns were out there. And this is what I saw. I was like, oh my gosh, I hope that bird makes it. But sure enough, it was fine, apparently, kept flying. A little bit blown off course, heading towards Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is a big area where terns like to rest during their migratory route. But here comes Hurricane Maria. And then our second male actually left shortly after. So we've got our second male coming down from Cape Cod, first male going towards Puerto Rico, as well as Hurricane Maria. So 741 flew through Jose as well. 745 stopping over on Puerto Rico. 741's making his way. And then I think this is another coffee moment where I looked at the data. Yep, September 20th. And basically these 2 males, number 741 and 745, were like neck and neck coming out of Hurricane Maria, which was pretty crazy to see. And then they kind of rendezvoused down in the Caribbean post-hurricane, and both arrived in Venezuela at 4 in the morning on September 23rd. So just incredible information on these birds that came, from the same tiny little island up in Maine and arriving in the same relatively small geographic area down in Venezuela. So a little bit of data on the males. They took a bit longer and a more circuitous route because they kind of got blown around by the hurricanes relative to the females. But still a pretty impressive flight overall. So I have a movie that kind of shows the data all together that's, I'll play now. So those are the 2 females leaving for Maine, staging on Cape Cod, across the Atlantic, no problem. There's the second one. And then there's one of the males heading to Cape Cod. There's that second one that did the detour. And that, I think, I can't remember what hurricane that was, but then this is Jose coming in. Here's Maria and the 2 males. So yeah, just really amazing data from these new satellite tracking technologies. So all of the information that I just summarized and a whole lot more are available in a report that we wrote for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which was our funding entity. And that is publicly available online at the following link, and you can find it pretty easily on Google as well. So a little bit about the current and future directions of the work that we're doing. So we're currently working on testing out the automated radio telemetry technology with the tracking stations and the radio tags on offshore wind turbines as well as offshore buoys. So we've been partnering with Ørsted at the Block Island Wind Farm on operating a tracking station for the past couple of years using different configurations of antennas and receiving units to try to optimize the use of this technology on offshore platforms. So we are continuing that work this year in partnership with Ørsted. And we're also working in partnership with NYSERDA, which is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, as well as multiple developers along the US Atlantic that are operating monitoring buoys and testing out different configurations of antennas and tracking stations on the buoys as well. So the real advantage of using this automated radio telemetry technology relative to the satellite telemetry technology that I showed with the Cominterns is that the tags are super lightweight, so they can be used on pretty much any species of bird as well as bats. And there's a lot of shared resources that help leverage research and monitoring dollars with the coordinated network that is implemented through MODIS. So it's really a great technology for doing large scale monitoring with big sample sizes. So we're trying to kind of push the science in terms of getting better offshore data by using stations on buoys and turbines. So we are also developing monitoring protocols for using automated radio telemetry studies at offshore wind farms, including stations on turbines and buoys that we're testing out currently. So this effort is funded through NYSERDA, and it's being led within our division of Migratory Birds, as well as Biodiversity Research Institute up in Maine, the University of Rhode Island, and Birds Canada, who operate the MODIS network. So this is currently ongoing and anticipated to have study products at the end of 2021. So we're developing guidance documents to help developers set up turbine and buoy stations in a standardized way, as well as guidance for tagging studies and coordinating across different research efforts and study design tools to help people plan their research. In addition, we are continuing to test new GPS and satellite-based technologies, including a pilot study using new GPS, GSM transmitters that have external like barometric pressure sensors, so we can get better altitude data on greater blackback gulls that are nesting on Block Island, as well as continuing to test GPS tags on common and Arctic terns in the Gulf of Maine in collaboration with Shoals Marine Lab, National Audubon, and other partners. So with that, I'd like to thank our funding entity, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, who's funded much of this research over the years and continues to do so. My colleagues from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, UMass Amherst, University of Rhode Island, Environment and Climate Change Canada, as well as the MODIS Wildlife Tracking System. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Pam. I think that that was an amazing presentation, and I'm still flabbergasted by the fact that the birds went right through the hurricane. It sort of came out at the other end. That's amazing.
Yeah, I'm actually modeling the data. I don't know if you've seen the global wind map, where the wind data are like particles that kind of swirl around. So I figured out finally how to code the wind particles with the terns as particles. So you can see actually like the movements of the hurricane in more detail. Oh. So we're working on that now currently and planning to publish it.
Okay, that's amazing. So I would like to invite our audience, if you have questions, just type them in the Q&A section. We're already getting some for you to answer, Pam. So we appreciate that. Our first question is from Rob. And I know Rob knows about radio, and his question is the telemetry FM packet, what speed?
Could you rephrase that question?
Okay. All right.
I'm not quite sure if I understand the technical.
Okay. So Rob, if you want to give that one another go, we will ask Pam the question. Eric has a question about how do birds navigate over open water?
Yeah, that's one of those cool mysteries of migration that we have some information on, but there's a lot still to learn. So there's different cues that birds can use for navigation. The stars is one, and that's why it's thought that many species like the piping plover migrate at night. So they can use kind of the geometry of the stars to help navigate. There's also kind of electromagnetic information that they can sense, as well as just visual cues of the landscape.
Okay, thank you. Catherine would like to know, how do you catch the birds in order to tag them?
That is a great question. So for the terns, they nest in pretty dense colonies. So there's, thousands of terns nesting on Monomoy, for example. So we have a walk-in trap, which is basically like a box that has a trap door with a treadle. And terns are really easy to catch during the breeding period. You basically just put the box over their nest and they walk into it and trip the trap door. So it's really quick. And yeah, they go right back to the nest after we finish, tagging them. So they're easy to monitor following release, which is another important component of tagging. Piping plovers are pretty similar, but they nest kind of more dispersed, whereas the terns are in a dense colony. The piping plovers are kind of scattered throughout the beach. So we'll pick a nest that's, at a good stage in where the eggs are for trapping, and we'll set up a similar type of walk-in trap. And basically, just pull the trap door when they sit down on their eggs.
Thank you for that. And how do you attach the transmitters to the birds?
So the piping plover, we use super glue, and the tags fall off sometimes pretty quickly, like within a few days, and then most of them will stay on at least through migration. So we do have some tag loss prior to migration, which reduces our sample size of migrating birds a little bit. But the trade-off is the tags fall off the birds and don't cause like a long-term effect by having to carry that extra gram around. So it's a good trade-off with the super glue tags, even though we have some loss. With the terns, if you just super glue the tags to their backs, because they plunge dive for fish, the tags fall off like immediately. So we needed a solution that would allow the tags to fall off at some point, but still allow us to collect data during the breeding and post-breeding period. So we worked with a vet to develop a method where the tags are attached using glue and held in place with 2 subcutaneous sutures. And that worked really, really well. It allowed the tags to stay on for about 2 to 3 months, and then kind of fall off the bird afterwards. The satellite tags, because they're a little bit heavier and because they could potentially last multiple years, and they're also way more expensive, we wanted to have a longer term tag attachment method. So we worked with a seabird researcher that had lots of experience using harness material to attach tags to terns. So we did that, and it worked really well for the common terns.
Okay, thank you, Pam. Peter says, very cool technology. And how are the lightweight VHF tags powered?
So they have a internal battery. I don't know a whole lot of detail about the battery, but I do know that the tag weight varies with how long the battery lasts and what the ping rate is. So if you have the tags emitting signals every 5 seconds, it'll last longer than a tag that emits signals every 2 seconds. So there's a trade-off there with the study design, depending on how big the tagged bird is.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of questions about the towers. who owns the towers, and are the towers on Monomoy Wildlife Refuge still being used, operated?
Yeah, so the towers are that we have are owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they are still being operated as part of the MODIS wildlife tracking system. And we'll likely be doing some more tagging studies in the region that are sort of targeted with those towers in mind. With COVID, all of the tagging and fieldwork kind of came to a halt temporarily. So hopefully by next year, we'll be back out in the field.
Okay, all right, thank you. And a couple questions about the impact of wind farms on bird migration. So what do you see as the impact of the wind farms?
So we're trying to get a handle on what possible effects might be, but there's huge information gaps for a lot of these species that are very small and hard to collect movement data on. So we're working on a lot of assessments now, trying to get more information on movement patterns of different species that we're interested in, like the piping plover, the roseate tern, and then looking at what types of weather conditions they're moving offshore in. So typically collision risk will increase if there is inclement weather, such as fog or heavy precipitation. So we've been doing a lot of work looking at different weather patterns that are associated with offshore movements, as well as trying to get a handle on their flight altitudes. We did some coarse estimation of altitudes using information from the radio telemetry array that's basically based off of the relationship between the detection distance that a station can pick up signals from a tagged bird and how high the tagged bird is flying. So we know that when the birds are flying higher, the distance is greater. And if we have simultaneous detections that are happening from two spatially separated stations to the same bird at the same time, we can estimate, well, it must be flying at least this high in order for that to be possible. So we looked coarsely at flights relative to the rotor swept zone of offshore wind turbines, but because that information is pretty coarse, we still have a lot to learn around flight heights. So we're still trying to figure out kind of basic information around, possible exposure of birds to wind turbines.
Okay, thanks. So that actually, I think, answers part of a question that Michelle had. So it's hard for you to estimate the altitude that they fly across the Atlantic then?
Yeah, so the satellite tags that we used on common terns were on the Argos tracking system. So they use Doppler shift to estimate two-dimensional locations, and there's 0 altitude data. I didn't get into the details of the current GPS tags that we're using on terns, but they actually do provide an altitude data that's estimated through satellites. So because the geometry of the satellites is much better for two-dimensional relative to three-dimensional, because there's no satellites below the birds, the altitude estimates are very variable and not super accurate using GPS alone. So this upcoming field season, we're testing out new GPS tags that have barometers that provide additional information on air pressure that we can use to hone in on flight altitude.
Okay, thank you. And Janet and Gary would like to know, why do the birds migrate all the way to South America instead of to the southern US?
Yeah, so that goes back to kind of their evolutionary history. And I don't know off the top of my head for terns, but different birds have different migratory routes, and it's kind of rooted in their evolution.
Okay. All right, thanks. So Dave has a question about, if birds can fly faster than a human can run a mile, how do they sustain that rate? And there's another question that sort of goes along with that talks about, are they flying all the time, or are they going with the wind currents?
Yeah, so they can fly pretty far, and there's been some cool work showing that they'll like shut off part of their brain and sleep with half of their brain and continue flying with the other half. So that's super cool and allows them to fly for, days on end without stopping. And they also get wind assistance with the right wind conditions. So we saw with the piping plovers, they were waiting until there were nights that had clear skies, no rain. So like very clear, good weather for flying in a tailwind, and then they would take off.
Okay, great. Joe would like to know, is the behavior of the bird affected by the presence of the radio transmitters? Does it change their behavior? Does it hurt them?
Yeah, we wanted to know that too, big time when we first started, especially when we tagged the listed species, piping plover and the roseate tern. Anything that could potentially create, some kind of adverse effect is really concerning, especially for listed species. So we did a lot of monitoring of tag effects, especially the first year that we did the study with smaller sample sizes. And we were, measuring preen rates between tagged birds and non-tagged birds. And we looked at how many chicks the terns were fledging. So basically, if the tern is having a hard time with a tag, for example, it will affect the rate at which it's feeding its chick. And then the chick will be an indicator that something's wrong with the fishing activity of the tern. So we did a lot of work looking at the number of chicks that tagged birds were able to raise versus non-tagged birds. That was actually a whole chapter of my dissertation. And we didn't find an effect, which was good. And then we were, just keeping lots of eyes on them for any abnormal behavior. Or signs of, possible injury due to the attachment. So we felt really good about the safety of the method from that work.
Great. And Tom would like to know, how many migrations might a tern make in their lifetime?
Yeah, so that's a cool question. So through long-term banding programs, like the one on Monomoy National Wildlife Refuge, for example, and over on Great Gull Island, which is in Long Island Sound, and has had, I think, 50 years of tern banding under the American Museum of Natural History. There's a lot of information on individual birds that come back to breed year after year after year. And I believe the oldest, or among the oldest terns on record, from our region are from the colony in Eastern Long Island Sound on Great Gull Island. And they're like up in the 30s. So I don't know offhand what the oldest tern is that they had on record, but I think they definitely have some that are kind of in the 30-year-old range. So yeah, so that's 30 round trips at least for those terns.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah.
It's super cool.
Yeah. Liz, who's a viewer, would like to know, what was your most surprising finding in your study?
Probably all those piping plovers shooting just offshore. That was really cool to see. I suspected that some of them did that. And because shorebirds fly, over the ocean commonly, across different species, but we just didn't have the information for piping plover. And we know they winter in the Bahamas, so they have to fly offshore at some point. But I was pretty surprised to see, the birds that were nesting at Monomoy taking off from Monomoy and flying all the way across the Atlantic to North Carolina. That was just really cool to see. So yeah, that was probably up there with interesting findings. And then just seeing those terns flying through the hurricanes too was super cool.
That's amazing. And they're also very smart because they chose to winter in the Bahamas. So good for them.
Yeah. And some smart biologists also get to go down to the Bahamas where they winter because, it's full annual cycle work we're doing. So works out for everybody.
Another viewer would like to know, of the species that you've studied, which one holds the migratory speed record?
Wow. So I didn't talk about red knots because there was a lot of information to cover, but they are pretty cool in the sense that they, will fly nonstop, very long distances, from South America, for example, Brazil up to Delaware Bay in the spring. So yeah, I don't know speeds off the top of my head, but they also select tailwinds. So under good conditions, they can probably, reach pretty high flight speeds.
Well, you do amazing work. I think it's been a very eye-opening presentation this evening. I think we've learned a lot, and we'll certainly look at birds with a different appreciation for certainly the distances that they travel.
Yeah.
And certainly the weather that they go through.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to think of how small they are and what they're able to accomplish.
Yeah. Are there any other websites or resources that you would recommend if people are interested in looking at this further?
Sure. So the MODIS wildlife tracking system has a really information-packed website. It's called MODIS, MOTUS.org. So if you're interested in the automated radio telemetry technology, I would definitely check that out first. There's a lot of cool information on, birds like the red knot. There's a great book called Moonbird that talks about a red knot that was tracked, over so many flights that it went to the moon and back over the course of its lifetime. So I would recommend, if you're looking for a new pandemic book. I think it's in like the young adult category, but I thought it was great story. So.
Okay, thanks so much for those recommendations. That'll be wonderful. So Pam, again, I want to express our appreciation for being with us tonight, as well as your continued help on our new exhibit. We don't have a title for it, but it will be bird tracking, and it's we'll be having this ready for this upcoming season. It will be panels about some of the things that you talked about, the radio tracking, as well as we'll have a video and so on. So in our appreciation for your efforts, and it's good to know that you drink coffee, but we will be sending you this CMMC mug.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, so you can watch the birds go through the hurricane in one of our mugs.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so, and then hopefully later this spring, we will look forward to having you pay us a visit.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to connecting with some of your radio folks and, seeing the site and learning a little bit more about the history. But yeah, it'll be fun to collaborate on some of this stuff.
Yeah, so thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank our viewers tonight. Thank you for participation, for your great questions, and for supporting us. We hope to see you next month on April 1st for Lauren Lamb, who will be talking about autonomy in the marine industry at Sea Robotics. So we'll see you then. And thanks again, Pam, and everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
You too. Thanks.